So what happened for me is I became interested in World War II because basically all of my relatives, all my Jewish uncles, grandfathers, everyone served in World War II, and I grew up with it as a sort of basic part of my childhood, this question of World War II and the Jews. And I decided I wanted to write a book about it, so I started to look through the bestseller lists in the New York Times, and I found this remarkable and astonishing thing, which was that in 1948, on the bestseller list, there were 6 books by and about Jewish soldiers in 1948 that dominated the bestsellers list. 6 books. And the books were these books. The Naked and the Dead by Norman Mailer, Irwin Shaw's The Young Lions, Errol Wolfert's An Act of Love, Merle Miller's That's Winter, and Stephen Himes' The Crusaders. And then Martha Gellhorn, has anyone heard of Martha Gellhorn? Oh yeah, she was a very important war correspondent, but who was married to Ernest Hemingway. And she wrote about World War II, and she wrote a book that also did very well called The Wine of Astonishment. So when I realized that Jews were basically writing all the World War II books right after the war, I kept going through the bestsellers list, and I kept seeing that in every era from World War II onwards, it was Jewish writers who dominated. So in the 1950s, we have Herman Wouk's The Caine Mutiny, which was the biggest American bestseller since Gone with the Wind. So that's Herman Wouk. We also have Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which also was obviously a huge, massive bestseller. So what I argue in my book, and I think I have the evidence to prove it, is that much in the same way that in Hollywood, we know that Jewish producers and directors really taught Americans how to understand all these things about American culture, even Christmas. What I argue is that Jewish American writers taught Americans how to understand World War II, because they were at the forefront of it. And what I also noticed when I was writing the book was that nobody had written about this before or thought about this idea of why were Jews so important in all of the fiction. There's one writer, though, who wasn't a Jew. Does anyone know who the one non-Jewish big best-selling writer of World War II was? James Jones, From Here to Eternity. So there was one non-Jewish writer, right? James Jones, From Here to the Eternity, and The Thin Red Line. And so to write my book, I went into the archive. I went into all of the archives of all of these writers, right? I also went into Jones's archive because I wanted to know, well, we have this one non-Jewish guy, what's his story? And I discovered that he was in dialogue whenever he was writing with Norman Mailer. And he basically was writing the same type of books as Norman Mailer. And he was absolutely 100% emulating the way that Jewish writers were writing about World War II, to such an extent that all of his main characters were Jewish as well, the really prominent characters in his books too. So what I did was I started to read all these best-selling books, and what I found was that in terms of how Jews had tended to be represented, there was this idea that Jews were weak and that they were not effective warriors, and we could never think of Jews as soldiers because they're too effeminate and they're too intellectual. But what these books were telling instead was a story in which it wasn't the Germans who were killing the Jews, it's the Jews killing the Germans. They're going in World War II and they're killing the Germans. It's turning everything around its head. So rather than the Holocaust exterminating the Jews, we're getting all of these best-selling World War II books in which the protagonists are Jews killing the Germans, completely turning the trope on its head. And so what was happening was that these bestsellers were telling American readers that there was this new and very exciting vision of what it meant to be a Jew. And it wasn't the Jewish victim of the Holocaust, it was the Jewish soldier who was going to go out, fight, and slay Germans. Does that make sense? So they were turning it all on its head, and they were extremely popular. So at the point in time when they were writing the books, Jews were in a very precarious position in the United States. It wasn't clear, were they white people? Were they closer to black people? Were they a minority? How should we look at them? And it makes sense to me that these Jewish writers, when they're writing these books, could take on that weird status as well and tell people, the readers, what does it mean to be a member of a minority culture as well. So they're bringing all of this stuff together in these novels. And what's, I think, extremely important is that the novels are very, very popular, right? So Americans are reading these books and they're learning about World War II. And I'm going to talk about the Holocaust too, because all these books talk about the Holocaust too. So what I want to do is I'm going to talk about a handful of the books, and then I'm going to focus on two specific trends in them. One is how they talk about liberalism, and then I want to talk about the Holocaust, because when I wrote this book, and now I'm currently writing a new book on Jewish commandos, a historical book on Jewish commandos of World War II. For both that book and this book, my intention was to write about World War II, because I'm really interested in World War II, and I did not want to write about the Holocaust. When I wrote this book and the new book I'm writing, everything is about the Holocaust when people write about World War II and the Jewish story, even when we talk about American Jews. So what happened with these books is that they became bestsellers very, very quickly, right? So they went out and they went out in the paperback edition. And the question is, are they good works of art? Like when we think about The Naked and the Dead, obviously, how many of you have read The Naked and the Dead? It's a work of art when you read The Naked and the Dead, I would argue. And when you read Catch-22, work of art, would you say? But has anyone read Young Lions? It's not, what?
Just the movie.
And I might talk about the movie a bit. It's not really a work of art. Basically, most of the best-selling Jewish novels about World War II were something that people would term middle brow. Does that worm for the masses, popular, you know, a little bit schmaltzy and stuff like that. So the majority of these books that became these best-selling World War II books were not artistic masterpieces, but they were popular bestsellers. So they spoke in a way that would appeal to readers who were not just Jewish, because it was mainstream America who was eating these books up. So the question I also asked myself is, what were they saying that was appealing so deeply to the readership? And what were they teaching America in the process as well? So because they were best-selling books, what we have to realize about them is that this is stuff that would get out to mainstream America and teach them about the war. And at this time, America after World War II was going through a paperback boom. So what had happened during World War II, and if you can switch it, I think I have a foot, yeah I do, is that during World War II, American GIs voraciously read. There were books being disseminated to all the troops, and they were reading paperback books. So when they came back from the war, there was this appetite for reading that had never existed before in American society. And it was also very democratic. It was for men, women, you know, all of the different classes started to read. Because before the war, often there was this idea in mainstream America that if women did book clubs or they read in libraries, it was very parochial, and then the good books were for the men, or the more artistic books, etc. But what happens when we get into World War II is we start getting everybody reading all of these books, and it's getting disseminated. And we're starting to get all this literature, good literature, poor literature, and primarily literature about the war. So regardless of the books themselves that all of these Jewish writers were writing about with World War II, whatever artistic merit they had, they presented the platoon and the Jewish fighter and the soldier generally in World War II in terms of a platoon, which was a microcosm of America. So you would take a platoon, and the way the writers would write about it would be that the platoon would be the story of America. How so? Because it would be a story of a lot of people from different places coming together, right? This is like the American dream, working together and doing what needs to be done. So this becomes a larger story of America. At the same time, all of the war stories have a protagonist, which I'll talk about in a second, who has to go through something really, really hard and transcend it and go through a heroic struggle in order at the end to win, whatever that one means. So these books start coming out in 1948, right? So part of what my book was about was not about the war. It was about how people wrote about the war in the 50s and in the 60s. And what I discovered was that in different eras, Jews wrote about the war differently depending on the insecurities that Jewish Americans faced. So I'm going to tell you a little bit historically about that. because it matters when Jews were writing these books. So all of these books are published after the war, and in the 1950s in America, in sort of Jewish history, it's called the golden age of Jewish America, is considered the 1950s, and it was the golden age for Jews in America, in some senses. Why? Because Jews were becoming wealthier, they were becoming better educated, they were becoming more mobile, they were becoming more assimilated, and when we look at charts of anti-Semitism in America, in the 30s, it was terrible in America during the Depression. That was the heyday of anti-Semitism. After the war, it basically disappears in sort of public discourse. Of course, there's McCarthyism, which I'll get to, but on all the other fronts, this is a golden age for Jews. So the people who are writing these books, like Norman Mailer, they grow up during the really bad times. They grow up during the 30s when there's all this anti-Semitism, and they're basically every single writer of these books were the children of Yiddish-speaking, urban, Jewish, working-class families, almost all of them in New York City, and they all were raised Jewishly. They all knew Judaism. They were all raised pretty much in Jewish ethnic enclaves. They didn't have much interactions with non-Jews. And they attended public schools, and that was their world. And so what happens during the Depression is that these boys who are living in this situation find that rather than going, after the Depression, rather than going to college, they go and serve, right? So their college years are their years in war. And so after the war, what happens to the Jewish community is they come back to America, and this is where we get the golden age, where we get the GI Bill, where they can all go to college, right? So we get mobility, we get all of this generation of Jews who had gone from poor working class childhoods, after the war, getting to go to college, right? Getting social mobility, getting economic mobility, moving out to the suburbs, and we have this huge, massive boom, economic boom for Jews. And then suddenly after the war, Jewish Americans who before the war had been really working class, and all of these writers are definitely the children of the working class, after the war, the Jewish American community becomes one of the wealthiest communities in America. And that's when we're getting the books written, from these guys who have gone through this era to this era. So now we get after the war, what starts to happen is politically, though, there's a really big shift. And I'm going to talk about that when I talk about the different books. Before the war, as I'm sure many of you know from your own families, Jews tended to embrace socialism, right? And like liberalism and whatever the terminology would be for that. And there was this idea before the war about fighting against injustices and so on and so forth. When we get after the war and we get the rise of McCarthyism and the Cold War, a lot of Jews felt very conflicted about what was the role of the Jewish community in terms of dealing with McCarthyism. And that comes up too in the Jewish war novels. But for all the writers of the Jewish war novels, who were all of the writers of all the best-selling novels grew up in these sort of socialist-minded, Yiddish-speaking families in cities, they really embraced liberalism and I don't know what the term would have been at the time, a belief in equality for all, and that comes through in the novels too. So part of what I argue in my book is that these books that the Jewish best-selling writers are creating is really a means for them to talk about America. So much so that of all the best-selling writers that I talked about at the start, the 5 books, every single one of them had something to do to oppose McCarthyism after the war. And what I argue is that their books also are sort of, in a way, arguing against, and I'll give you some examples of it. So all these books come out in 1948. In 1948, I don't know if you know this or not, but you probably do, the House Un-American Committee Against Communism in Hollywood was starting to ratchet up steam. So in 1948, all these books are coming out, and these are all books about the war. And at the same time, all of the authors are dealing with the anti-communist witch hunts, every single one. So Ira Wolford, who wrote one of the top 5 books, was labeled a communist by association by HUAC, the House Un-American Committee. Irwin Shaw and Merle Miller, 2 more of the writers, were part of the Hollywood blacklist. Stephen Heim, another one, moved back to East Germany in order to escape McCarthyism. And Martha Gellhorn, the other writer, wrote pieces for the New Republic about the reactionaries and races of HUAC. Norman Mailer, his second novel after this, and Irwin Shaw, another one of the writers, and Merle Miller, all of them wrote their second novels after their war novels about the dangers of the Red Scare and the dangers of McCarthyism. So this is really elemental to what they're trying to say in their books, I would argue. So what are they trying to say in terms of the idea of liberalism, and then I'll talk about the Holocaust? You can look at them from a lot of different angles, these books, but basically all of the Jewish American war novels of 1948 are arguing very, very clearly that pluralism is really good for America, that the platoon with a lot of different people, Mexican Americans, whoever they may be, is good for America, and that all communities after the war need to be treated equally, including African Americans. All of us need to be treated equally. So the platoon becomes that ideal America where we all get on with each other, and we're going to show it in the books. Does that make sense? And they're coming at it from this kind of very liberal angle. And this was always evident in the books. And when in Norman Mailer, when he writes about In the Naked and the Dead, he talks about this. He has quotes about it, about how the most negative characters are in the books are the ones who are putting down the Jewish characters because the Jewish characters are too communist or too caring, whatever it may be. So they're challenging this stuff. All of this shifts in the 1950s, because in the 1950s, the Jewish community, on the one hand, they're getting wealthier, on the other hand, they're getting much more insecure, because now McCarthyism is really picking up steam in the 1950s, and a lot of Jews dealt with the witch hunts, and there was a lot of fear in the Jewish community at the same time that there was a lot of economic stability. So in the 1950s, when we have our Jewish writers writing about World War II, the two main ones are Herman Wouk in The Caine Mutiny, and Leon Uris from Exodus. He also wrote a best-selling war novel called Battle Cry. So both of these books come out in the 1950s. Both of these books have a totally different take on the American military. The novels of 1948 by all the very liberal writers saw the American military as this ideal of community and liberalism. These writers instead say, no, that's not what is important about the American military. What's important about the American military is it teaches all of us that we have to conform, we have to follow the rules, we have to listen to our elders, we have to be deeply patriotic. So The Caine Mutiny and Battle Cry are huge bestsellers in the 1950s, and both of them are arguing very clearly for patriotism, right? Americans must be patriotic. And not only that, in both of those books, the way that they talk about the Jewish community is the Jewish community was the community that fought against the Germans, and in America are deeply, deeply grateful to the American military for having saved the Jews of Europe. Herman Wouk says that. We Jews are so grateful that the military saved us. So basically what the books are saying is to the public, we American Jews are grateful for what you did to save us. And we want you to hear that. Don't think we're communists. Don't think that you can't trust it. We are so grateful. Thank you, America. And we're deeply patriotic. And those two tones are so deep in the book that Herman Wouk's book actually got taught all around in American classes throughout the country in terms of an effective representation of what patriotism was. Like, this is how one becomes patriotic. And then when we get into the 60s, it all shifts again with Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which breaks it all apart, challenges conformity, talks about rebellion and radicalism. And I would argue, and I think it's true, that Catch-22 heralds in sort of like people challenging conformism and talking against it and the new kind of radicalism. So I think the other thing I want to say about liberalism, then I'll talk about the Holocaust, is so why were these books so extremely popular? And I think part of why they were so popular in the 40s and 50s also didn't only have to do with the war. It had to do with this feeling that I think a lot of people had in the 50s when they were living in suburbs, when things were too stable, that the war still seemed as this ideal place of action where you didn't have to be, you didn't get stuck with a family. You weren't stuck taking care of your house in the suburbs. You got to be really living an exciting life. You weren't burdened by family. And so part of what I write about in the book is that in the 50s, when these American Jewish war novels are so popular, it's because they're also the exact opposite of the suburban man. The suburban man has his family and he has a job he has to go to and he doesn't get to rebel. And the soldier has everything that's missing, and I think is part of the reason that these books were so deeply popular. The soldiers are not burdened by a wife, they're not burdened by a kid, they can break free of it all. So just a last point about that before I talk about the Holocaust is, of course, it's important to note that all of these books, really all of them except for one, were written by men. This is really a male story. And it's really interesting to me that it's a male story because in American Jewish literature, most of the writing that was really important before the 50s were by women. It was women immigrants who were writing all the main Jewish books. And then suddenly after the war, because of the times, because of the need for a new ideal of what a man is, women's voices completely disappear in Jewish American writing. There were just, can anyone name any from the 50s? It's not about women writers and Jewish women writers, and it had been before. Now it's about Philip Roth and Saul Bellow and Norman Mailer, et cetera, and I think in part it's because it comes out of the rhetoric of the war novel, these new men, this way to look at things, this very masculine perspective. So the other point I want to just talk about a little bit is about the Holocaust, because these books were doing something very unusual about the Holocaust. There had been this prominent belief in American studies and Jewish studies that Americans did not talk about the Holocaust, American Jews, American at large, until the publication of the Diary of Anne Frank in 1952. Jewish novelists stayed away from it, the Jewish community didn't go there. It was just something that there was we're not going to discuss this. It's completely untrue. All of those best-selling novels of 1948 that I started by talking about, every single one had scenes about the Holocaust in them. And they were explicit and horrific scenes. So, we had thought that for American Jewish life and war writing, there were books about World War II, and there's books about the Holocaust, and they're completely different. In these books, they merge the two together from a Jewish perspective. In all of these books, the Holocaust comes up, and in some of them, in fact, in all of the ones that are set in Europe, the protagonist goes to the death camps, sees what's happening to the Jews, and the writer writes about it. And it's really important to realize that, because what that tells us is that in 1948, with these best-selling books, mainstream America thinks that they're going to be reading about World War II. What they're actually getting at the same time is the story of the Holocaust, right? And they're getting it much earlier than we think that they are. And the reason people hadn't sort of talked about this before was because there was this feeling that if you were looking at literature, why would you look at trashy pop bestseller novels? Why look at that stuff? Look at the good stuff. But if we look at the trashy best-selling novels, some of the ones I'm talking about, then you see the story about the Holocaust that's really, really important. And what we have is this idea in the novels of 1948 that the writers are going to tell you about the Holocaust because you guys don't know the story, and I need to tell you the story of what's happening there. When we get to the 50s, when Americans know about the story, like with Herman Wouk, now it's not so much to report on the Holocaust, which we have in the first stories, but to teach Americans to memorialize it and to remember it and ways to remember it. And I even argue in my book, it's not provable, but I actually think in Catch-22 there's a big shadow of the Holocaust too. How many people have read Catch-22? Do you remember this really strange chapter in Catch-22 where he goes through Rome? There's this very weird chapter where he wanders through Rome. There's all of this gore in it. And there's even these lines in it where he talks about walking down the street, Yossarian's walking down the street, and he sees a young Jewish boy walk up to him with a star on his cheek. Like there's all of this Holocaust imagery. And so what I argue, take it or leave it, is basically even in Catch-22 where he's trying to get away from that and write about the war in general, it's everywhere in the book as well. So I just want to say a few more things, then I'm going to wrap it up. If you can switch it. So part of the way that the Jews wrote about World War II is not only about the Holocaust and not only about liberalism, but they wrote about anti-Semitism in the military. And in The Wine of Astonishment, Martha Geller's book, and you can see she copied the cover, they played with the cover of Gentleman's Agreement. Gentleman's Agreement is all about anti-Semitism in America. Does anyone remember it? It's about sort of the anti-Semitic trope. That was a hugely important movie. It won the Academy Award. Wine of Astonishment is also all about anti-Semitism in the military. The way that all of the writers wrote about the military was it being an incredibly anti-Semitic space in which the Jewish protagonist is only a Jew because he's the victim of anti-Semitism. It's not because he keeps kosher or goes to Sabbath service. It's because he's constantly a victim of anti-Semitism. And this is important because this was really popular. You probably don't know this, but after the war, discussions of anti-Semitism were really popular in America. And in Europe, Jean-Paul Sartre published Anti-Semite, which was hugely popular. This was an issue that was in the air, and these writers wrote about it as well. And the way that they wrote about it was that Jews were victims of anti-Semitism by serving in the military. Now, is that true? No, it's somewhat true, but as Deborah Dash Moore, who wrote G.I. Jew, wrote about, actually the level of anti-Semitism wasn't so high for most people in the war. But the way that Jewish war novelists wrote about it was every minute was anti-Semitic when they were serving. And so why were they doing that? I think that they were doing it because they wanted to talk again about post-war America. They wanted to say to America after the war, we must stop any of our anti-Semitism. We've done enough of this. If we're anti-Semitic, we're like the Germans, and we need to create a new idea of what America is. So just to end, because I'd rather talk to you than talk at you and take questions. So what's the larger issue? Oh, just one last point, if you can do one more quote, one more thing. I didn't talk about the war in the Pacific, but when we have Jewish American writers talking about the war in the Pacific, and talking about the Japanese, the way that they portray it is that American soldiers are much more comfortable killing Japanese than they are killing Germans. Why? Because American military members see Germans as European brothers, and they see the Japanese as these enemy aliens, right? And what the Jewish writers are arguing instead is it's the Germans who are the monsters. And it's the Japanese, and this is a quote about the way that one of the soldiers talks to one of the characters in one of the books, that it's the Japanese who are also the victims of hatred. They flip everything on its head when they talk about the Pacific. So just to conclude, so that I can take questions or we can talk about it, is, again, why are these novels so popular? And what I went to a friend of mine when I was writing the book, and I said, why do you think everyone was reading these novels? And he said, he wasn't a Jewish guy, and he said, my grandfather was obsessed with Norman Mailer and all of these books. He read all of these books, and he had served in World War II. And I said, well, why would these books about these Jewish protagonists be so popular with your granddad, who was like this very non-Jewish guy who had served? And he said, and I think he's right about this, that because Jews were sort of a member of America, but they were also members of a minority, the authors could write about Jewish protagonists in World War II in such a way that they can make like the Jewish soldier scared or worried or cry when his buddy dies or whatever it may be, show emotions. And so when these writers wrote about World War II, they wrote about the soldier in very different ways than Hemingway had written about them. Hemingway had written about American soldiers as stoic and non-emotional and non-intellectual and very hard. Jewish writers wrote their protagonists as suffering and worried and intellectual and emotional, all of this stuff. And I think that for a lot of readers in America, these Jewish guys were very cathartic because it sort of said it's okay to have emotions about World War II. It's okay to have these experiences and not be certain about them and to question them. So I think somehow being a Jew and experiencing war and writing about it made mainstream Americans more comfortable with the issues at play as well. So just to end, so one of the most remarkable things about Jewish war novels of the 1940s to 1960s, which is what I write about, is this very bizarre thing that at that time, Jews were only about 4% of the population, right? Like they're a tiny little proportion. But it's these novels that are so important and on which all of them, there's huge movies as well, which I didn't even go into, and you can ask them about it if you want. They created the template through which Americans saw World War II. So although at the time there was different forms of media, and we have film, and later we have television, and we have radio, and we have plays, for a serious discussion of World War II in America after the war, people looked at novels and they looked at reading. And the GI Bill had brought all these people into college and sparked an interest in education that had never existed in America before. And so what happens in these Jewish authored works about World War II is that this very marginal, statistically marginal population of Jewish writers become the principal figures through which World War II is told to Americans. And then mainstream Americans read the books and start understanding what World War II and the Holocaust means through looking at the representations of this very, very marginal group. So that's my thesis. I've sort of cut it down a bit because we're a small group. If you have any questions, let me know. And I did go into all the archives, and I can answer questions about any of the writers too, as well. So there you go. Does anyone have any questions?
Have you read Joe Bendersky's book, The Jewish Threat?
No, tell me about it. Is it a novel or is it a...
No, nonfiction about anti-Semitism in the United States Army, principally through World War II. Maybe
Right.
A little bit later.
Right.
Bendersky is a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University.
See, it's interesting, like, so Norman Mailer claimed after World War II, like I saw these interviews with him, he said there was no anti-Semitism in the Army. I never experienced that, right? I went into his archive in the University of Texas, and I read all of the letters he wrote to B. Silverman, and I looked at everything he was writing. And so after the war, he says, there's no anti-Semitism. Well, guess, of course, what I find in the archives. Letters and letters about the anti-Semitism he's experienced in the war. So I don't know if he meant to reinvent it. I don't know if he didn't want to think about it. But when you get, that's why these documents of the war are so important, because when he wrote home, he's talking about how he's being treated, and he's talking about this stuff. Herman Wouk as well, actually interviewed Herman Wouk for this book. And then he wrote me a letter, and he said in the letter, there was no anti-Semitism in World War II in the Army. So it's a very strange thing. Like, some of the writers said it was everywhere and endemic, and some of them said there was none of it. So Deborah Dash Moore's book is really important because she went and interviewed all of these GIs, and she said that the general feeling was that there was anti-Semitism, but not, like, really not so much, not so extreme. So I don't know where the truth lies, but I know for my writers, it's very strange how they spoke about it versus what they experienced. Does that make sense? Yeah.
These experiences are all...
Where you were and
Yeah.
who you were with.
Or who you were with, what
Joe
branch you were in.
Bendersky, by the way, is book review editor for Holocaust and Genocide Studies.
Right.
Only do 12 books per issue.
Right.
He makes his own decisions, but you may want to have your publisher send.
Oh, right, yeah. Were you going to say something?
I mean, basically, what you said, they're all individual experiences, so whether...
And officers had less, like it depended where they were serving too. Yeah.
Whether it was anti-Semitism in the Army, it's...
Right.
Anti-Semitism in your personal experience, and a lot of there was some people,
Right.
they had none.
Right.
Well, some was just curious ignorance. My father told me that at one installation once, somebody from the Midwest who had never seen a Jew came up to him and looked very closely. He was looking for his horns.
Yeah, you should definitely watch the movie we're both in, G.I. Joe, because they really deal with it in a pretty funny way, actually, about what it meant. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
It kind of in the same. I'm thinking of Neil Simon. I know
Oh,
you're
right.
dealing with
Yeah,
race,
Biloxi. Right.
But I'm thinking in what was it, the trilogy.
Biloxi Blues, was that it?
Biloxi Blues.
Right.
And he certainly talks about
Right.
anti-Semitism in the military.
Yeah, and it's interesting because for all the novels of 48 I talked about, all the ones set in Europe, like the anti-Semitism, the way they portray in the military is extraordinary. It's like unbelievable, nonstop, constantly oppressive, etc. And I really do think, again, who knows where the truth lies, but I think for some of the writers when they were writing about anti-Semitism, they weren't necessarily talking about the military. They were talking about post-war America and saying, look guys, do we really want to be like the Germans? In fact, one of the novels, he says in it, like, look guys, do we want to be like the Germans? Like, do we want to treat Jews the way, we don't want to be like those people treating Jews that way. But Salinger as well, like J.D. Salinger, who I don't really write much in the book, but I've done some work on, he served as well in all of these campaigns, and it became the shadow over the rest of his life, in my opinion, as well.
You brought that out.
Oh yeah, that's right, I talked about it. Yeah, I mean, it's, a lot of the information's coming out still about him, but he did go into, he had to go and be institutionalized for a while. And I said it in the film, his great story about World War II, Banana Fish, is about a Jewish GI who's married to this very sort of consumeristic American Jewish woman. They go to this fancy hotel in Miami, I think it is, and all she cares about is her like fancy hair and her fancy nails. And he goes for a swim and he comes back to the room and then he kills himself, because I think for what he was trying to say is the disjunction between what he experienced in the war, this GI, Salinger, and coming back and just sort of like middle-class suburban Jewish life was too much to bear. You know what I mean? Like the difference between the two of them.
I have two questions. One is, the first one, did you look at, did anti-Semitism or the experience vary on which branch of the military
Totally,
you served?
yeah.
And the second question is, did any of the writers who said they addressed to a certain extent other types of racism towards African American, Mexican American, did any of them in particular delve into that more deeply?
Mailer did deeply, because what happened with Mailer was, look, he came from New York City. He'd never been around anybody really but Jews, right? He sort of knows vaguely about Jim Crow and all the treatment of blacks. Blacks still are segregated during World War II. So this idea of liberalism, of course, is not really true, because blacks are not allowed into the platoons, right? So he goes, I read his letters about this. So he's sent to New Jersey. What's the military base in New Jersey? Which ones? Dix, Fort Dix. He's sent to Fort Dix. Well, Fort Dix is actually using these very repressive rules against black people. He gets out of the thing and he starts to see blacks being treated like Jim Crow in Fort Dix, and it freaks him out. And then he goes, I think he's he's trained a bit in the South as too. And what happened for all these Jewish writers, especially when they go to the South, is they deal with Jim Crow, right? And they've never seen this before. One of this Jewish writers wrote a book called Something About a Soldier, a Jewish writer, Mark Harris. It's about a Jewish guy in the Deep South during World War II in a base in the Deep South, seeing Jim Crow and organizing a boycott against Jim Crow. Like, it's all about the racism, right? So all of these guys write about the racism, and Mailer not only writes about the racism, he writes about the treatment of Mexican Americans too in his books. And on top of all of that, Mailer and Jones as well, and I think Wolford, another one, also write about the treatment of gay men too. They talk about homosexuality and the way that these guys are being brutalized in the military for being gay. So they were really tuned into it, and they really put it in their books, like really quite explicitly. And some people argue that part of the reason that Jews were so prominent in the civil rights movement after the war was because this was the generation who had gone to war, and they'd seen Jim Crow in the training camps in the South. They'd seen the treatments of blacks in the troops. They'd seen the treatment of Mexican Americans. They'd seen the treatment of gay men, and they came back with sort of a fire in their belly to fight this stuff. And it kind of makes sense to me because I see it in the books that they address this really head on. Yeah.
So, and your scholarship has focused on how this phenomenon came about,
Right.
but it comes to an end. There are no great Jewish war novels from the American perspective in the Korean or Vietnam.
I totally agree with you.
So what brings it to an end? I'm asking as someone who recently retired from the military.
Right.
And my experience is entirely different from
Right.
this generation that you have researched.
I think about it all the time. Like, what? I wonder if it's a class issue that these guys were really working class. Like Norman Mailer said this in his letters. He actually wrote this home to B. He said in his letters, "Save my letters because I want to use all this to write the great American war novel," right? And that wasn't just him. A lot of them they come from a working class environment. They see the military as a means to get experience about which to write about the great American novel coming out of the Hemingway thing. I don't know what it is.
Have you read The Conversion of Chaplain Cohen?
No. Is it about Korea or?
Yes, it's about the Korean War. It's about a Jewish chaplain.
Right. I was going to sort of extend this to the Korean War and I couldn't find it.
Right. It's the only one I've ever read.
It just shoots right down the level of it, especially because it's so extreme how much Jews are dominating in the 50s and the 60s. 62 with Catch-22, and then it just, I mean, people say it's true, like all of the, like all of the American TV shows about war, all of this stuff comes out of the Jewish writers, but I don't see anything happening with Korea and Vietnam. And I don't know why it is either. Why do you think it is? It's like maybe class issue? I don't know.
I'm not sure. The only thing I can think of is I once heard an interview with Mel Brooks.
Right.
Who is a little bit younger than these guys.
Right.
And Mel Brooks puts out the producers
Right.
in the 1960s, I think, early 60s.
Right.
And he was criticized royally for satirizing Hitler.
Right.
And I loved the interview with him because he said, "Excuse me, I was in the mechanized infantry. I invaded Germany.
Right.
Were those guys there?
Right.
If they had been there, I would listen."
Right.
So that's the last gasp of
Actually, that's a good point because I'm also thinking maybe because the war was personal for American Jews. These Nazis wanted to kill Jews, and I'm wondering if that might have inspired the art and the creativity and the desire to write these great novels that everyone would read. Versus the Korean War, it's not about a personal enemy, and I don't know, but I'm just.
Makes sense.
Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, I don't know.
Chaim Potok was inspired by his experience in the Korean War to go back and become a Jewish historian.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, in Israel, we get great war novels about this. I mean, I think there's this sense that when it's more personal, that people, I don't know what it is, though. I don't know. I've wondered, too, because I wanted to continue the work, and I was like, I can't find anything after.
Well, that's the next book, which is what happened to this.
Yeah, where did it go? It's very strange.
Remember in Sherlock Holmes, there was the curious incident of the dog at nighttime.
Right,
And Holmes and Watson says, but the dog did nothing at nighttime.
right.
So that was the curious.
Yeah, it's very curious. Any other questions?
Just an extension of, by Vietnam, Jews were staying out of it.
Best they could, they were. Actually, that's a very good point because.
No, of course
If you go upstairs.
Percentages.
No.
Yeah, but because Jews in World War II served statistically at like a higher number than like any other population. You're totally right, though. By Vietnam, though, like if you're married or you go to college, and Jews aren't working class anymore by Vietnam, so there's ways not to have to serve. What?
It was a controversial.
Yeah, and it was a controversial war, and Joseph Heller, like. Yeah. But it wasn't this thing that we had in World War II where Jews just went and volunteered, everyone you can think of did at this point. Again, I think partially because there was a sense this was a personal thing too. Yeah. Any other?
That's why the organization that supports this institution is unfortunately, I think, slowly withering away because percentages of Jews who opt to serve is fewer and fewer and fewer.
It's true. Is that true, Mike? I think that must be true.
That's something that's debated, and all veterans organizations are shrinking as the older
But since World War II.
Yeah.
Organizations are shrinking. The fact of the matter is the Jews in the military are pretty stable.
Yeah, we generally say that they continue to serve in the military about the same percentage that they are in the population. One of the challenges here, along like we were talking about, is we want to tell more Vietnam stories and recent stuff, Korea, and we try to. With World War II, it's easy to tell compelling Jewish stories. Vietnam, a lot of great stories. The question people ask, that's great, but what's Jewish about it?
That's true.
A guy that
Yeah.
happens to be Jewish.
Just come over to Fort Baltimore and, come to Friday night services and just bump and everybody got it.
Yeah, everybody, there's lots of good stories, no doubt. And some of them are the Jewish stories are chaplain related, people going to Jewish services, but there's nothing as compelling as Jews going off to fight Nazis.
It's really interesting because I looked at when I read this book, I looked at
There's
the-
the Inglorious Bastards movie.
right.
Jews killing Nazis. And
Well, my new book is about Jewish commandos of World War II who worked with the Brits, and a lot of them,
Who's going to publish it?
probably Simon & Schuster. We're waiting to find out tomorrow. Tomorrow they're having a bidding war, which is actually very cool. There you go, everyone. Whoa. But what I wanted to say was that for this book, I looked up the reading lists in Korean War. What were people actually reading? Because they had reading lists that they would give to the libraries. They were the number 1 and 2 books that they were reading were Herman Wouk and Leon Uris. So it's really strange. So these Jewish writers are actually are the people that people in the Korean War are reading when they're over and interned. Questions?
Even if you look at a television program like MASH, and you were saying the Jewish character was
To-
a psychiatrist.
Totally. That's sort of what people have argued is that MASH comes directly out of this lineage with Joseph Heller. Like he sets it up like intellectual. You're thinking about stuff. You're questioning stuff. It's funny. Like Joseph Heller in Catch-22 actually made it okay to laugh about war. Like that hadn't existed before as a trope. Joseph Heller creates it with Catch-22, and then we have all of this sort of popular stuff where now we can talk about it that way.
Wait a second, the Jewish psychiatrist goes back further. Do you remember the Raj Quartet?
No, what's that?
The Raj Quartet is 4 novels by Paul Scott.
Oh.
Published in exactly the same period, 1948. Best known in the United States because of the serialization that was done by British television, The Jewel in the Crown.
Oh,
Considered
right.
The top British television program of all time. And in that, the only Jewish character is the regimental psychiatrist.
Really? Oh,
Captain
right.
Samuels.
Right.
Who's,
Right.
his name.
Psychiatry was the Jewish science.
Yeah. It's funny though, because I write in the book about what they did with these books when they turned them into movies, like Young Lions, which you said you saw. Well, in the book, the Nazi is a subhuman monster. When they turn Young Lions into a movie, they make him Marlon Brando and make him really hot. Like it's totally terrifying. And the Jewish character in the book is like very Jewish, and he's actually killed at the end of the book. In the movie, they have him live and marry his non-Jewish sweetheart. There you go. And and for Catch-22, and then when they turned Thin Red Line, Jim Jones's book into a movie, I wanted to see what they would do with the main character. You guys probably has anyone read the Thin Red Line? The most important character is a Jewish character who's like the moral compass of the whole book. When they turn it into the movie, they don't make him Jewish anymore. They make him a Greek guy. So they get really complete. This was like 5 years ago. The only movie in which they keep the total Jewish ethos of any of these books is Catch-22. And Catch-22, Yossarian, they constantly are pretending in Catch-22 that Yossarian's not Jewish. Heller admitted much later, yes, he was in fact Jewish. Well, when they turn Catch-22 into a movie, they make all of the characters overtly Jewish. It's so interesting. So they put it all back in there, the stuff that Heller was trying to kind of obfuscate a bit. So, any other questions or comments? So thank you. Hopefully I'll be back next year or the year after on my Commando book, and thank you for coming out. Thank you.